I've driven through countless storms in my years as a delivery driver, but the blizzard of 2008 in rural Montana still haunts me. It was supposed to be a routine night, just one last delivery before heading home. Snow had started to fall heavily by mid-afternoon, but the GPS claimed it was only 15 miles to my destination. I figured I'd be fine. I was wrong. The road narrowed as I turned onto an unmarked path. The snowstorm intensified, turning the world into a white void. My truck's headlights barely pierced the thick curtain of snow. The trees on either side of the road were skeletal, their dark branches reaching out like claws. I couldn't see where the road ended and the ditch began, but I kept driving. I just wanted to finish and get home. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the side of the road, waving one arm frantically. He was bundled up in a coat and scarf, his face obscured by the heavy snow. My gut told me to keep driving. There was something unsettling about him, but I couldn't leave someone stranded in this storm. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "Can you give me a ride? My car broke down, and I need to get to a cabin nearby." I hesitated but nodded. He climbed into the passenger seat, bringing a rush of icy air with him. He didn't shake off the snow or even loosen his scarf. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. "Where's the cabin?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Keep going," he replied, his voice flat. The drive was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the howl of the wind. Every now and then, I glanced at him, but he never looked back. His hands stayed clenched in his lap, his breath fogging up the window. After a few miles, he pointed to a narrow trail barely visible through the snow. "Turn here." I stopped. "Are you sure that doesn't look like a road?" "It's fine," he said, his voice sharper now. "Just turn." Against my better judgment, I turned onto the trail. The truck groaned as it crawled through the deep snow. The trees grew denser, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. The storm seemed quieter here, but the silence was worse. "Stop here," he said abruptly. I did. He opened the door and stepped out, not saying a word. I leaned over, squinting through the windshield. "Do you need help getting to the cabin?" He paused, turning back slightly. "No, you've done enough." Then he disappeared into the woods. I sat there, debating whether to follow him or turn around. The storm was relentless, and the trail ahead was nearly impassable. I decided to head back. That's when I saw it. In my rearview mirror, there were no tire tracks. The snow was untouched, pristine, as if my truck had never driven down the trail. My heart pounded as I threw the truck into reverse. The path seemed narrower now, the trees pressing in closer. And then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that wasn't coming from the storm. I slammed on the brakes and looked around. The headlights barely illuminated the woods, but for a split second, I saw something. A shadow darted between the trees, impossibly fast. I floored the gas, desperate to get back to the main road. The trail seemed endless, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. I didn't realize I was crying until I tasted the salt of my tears. Finally, I burst out onto the main road. The relief was short-lived. Standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the snow, was the man. I swerved, narrowly missing him, and sped away. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. The attendant must have seen the terror on my face because he asked if I was okay. I picked up a guy, I stammered. Said he needed a ride to a cabin. The attendant froze. Was it on the old logging road? I nodded. He swallowed hard. That road's been closed for years. No one's lived in those cabins since the 70s. People say it's haunted by a man who froze to death out there after his car broke down. I didn't sleep that night. To this day, I avoid driving during storms. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see him standing in the snow, waving for help. and I wonder, if I hadn't stopped, would I have been his next victim? My name is Laura Hayes, and this story happened when I was 17. To this day, I avoid frozen lakes, no matter how thick the ice seems. It was a bitter January afternoon, the kind where the cold doesn't just nip but bites hard enough to leave scars. My dad and I had a tradition of ice fishing every winter, and this year, he'd convinced me to join him at a remote lake deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. The lake was secluded, beautiful, but eerily quiet. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the frozen expanse. Dad had his usual cheerful demeanor, hauling our gear like it was any other trip. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The moment we got there, the air felt heavy. "Laura, help me drill the hole," Dad called, his voice cutting through the silence. I nodded, grabbing the auger. As we worked, I noticed something strange. The ice beneath our feet wasn't as smooth as I expected. It was etched with deep, jagged lines, almost like claw marks. "Dad, do you see this?" I pointed at the strange patterns. He shrugged it off. "Probably just from the ice shifting," he said, not bothering to look closer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We set up the small fishing tent, lit a propane heater, and dropped our lines. Time passed slowly, as it always does when fishing, but the lake remained unnervingly quiet. There were no distant echoes of cracking ice, no howls of wolves in the forest, just a deep, oppressive silence. I was about to dowse off when I felt the line tug sharply. "Got one," I shouted, reeling it in with all my strength. But as I pulled, the line suddenly went slack. "What happened?" Dad asked, looking up from his hole. "Don't know, it just stopped," I replied, staring at the hole in the ice. Beneath the dim light of our lantern, the water looked darker than it should have, almost black, like a void. Then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the groan of a wounded animal, echoed across the lake. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "What the hell was that?" Dad whispered, his cheerful tone gone. Before I could respond, the ice beneath us cracked, a sound so sharp it felt like a gunshot. We Francais, terrified the entire lake would give way, but the ice held. "Let's pack up," Dad said, his voice shaking. "We'll come back another day." As we scrambled to gather our gear, I heard another sound, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the far side of the lake. It was so faint that I thought I was imagining it. But then Dad stopped, his eyes fixed on the same direction. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded. The tapping grew louder, like someone was knocking against the ice. "Maybe someone's out there," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Stay here," Dad ordered, grabbing the flashlight. He walked toward the sound, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I stayed by the tent, clutching the heater for warmth, my heart pounding. "Hello, Dad," called out. No answer. He took a few more steps, then stopped abruptly. "Laura," he whispered, turning back toward me. "Get in the truck, now." "What is it?" I asked, panic rising. "Just go," he snapped, his voice filled with an urgency I'd never heard before. I didn't argue. I ran to the truck, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I climbed inside. I glanced back at Dad. He was still staring at the far side of the lake, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Then I saw it, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, emerged from the shadows. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings. It didn't walk so much as glide across the ice, heading straight for my dad. "Dad, run," I screamed, but he was frozen in place. The thing stopped a few feet away from him. Even from the truck, I could see its face, or what should have been a face. It was smooth and pale, like ice itself, with two deep, hollow pits where eyes have been. The creature raised a long, claw-like hand and pointed at my dad. The ice beneath him cracked violently, and before he could react, he was swallowed by the freezing water. I screamed, flinging open the truck door. But when I looked back at the lake, both Dad and the creature were gone. The police said it was a tragic accident, that the ice must have been weaker than we thought. They never found my dad's body. I know what I saw though. That thing wasn't human. And now every winter, when the lakes freeze over, I hear tapping on my windows at night. A faint, rhythmic knock that makes my blood run cold. My name is Ethan, and what I'm about to tell you has kept me awake for years. It happened when I was working at a remote ski lodge during the off-season. The lodge was a quiet, sprawling structure, nestled deep in the snowy wilderness, cut off from the world for months at a time. The winter storms that season were brutal. Days would pass without sunlight, the sky constantly blanketed with gray clouds. The only sound was the wind howling through the trees and the occasional creak of the old building settling under the weight of snow. I was the only staff member left behind to keep the place in shape until the tourists returned. One evening, a storm rolled in. The kind of storm that makes you feel like the world is closing in on you. I was in the main lounge, tending to the fire, when I heard a knock at the door. A knock? Out here? It didn't make sense. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and the roads were completely buried under snow. No one should have been out in this storm. I hesitated before answering, but the knocking grew more insistent. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. Standing there was a man, his face pale and gaunt. He wore an old-fashioned coat and a scarf, and his boots were caked in ice. His eyes were wide, almost pleading. "Please," he said, his voice trembling. "I got caught in the storm. Can I come in?" I couldn't say no. Whoever he was, he'd freeze to death out there. I led him inside, and he collapsed into the nearest chair by the fire. As he warmed himself, I noticed something odd about him. His clothes looked dated, like they belonged to another era, but I dismissed it. Maybe he was a hiker or a history enthusiast. I offered him some hot coffee, which he accepted gratefully. He introduced himself as Victor, though he didn't say much else. Every time I tried to ask where he came from, or how he ended up here, he changed the subject or gave vague answers. The storm raged on, and night fell. I showed Victor to one of the guest rooms and told him he could stay until the weather cleared. He thanked me, but there was something in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the lodge seemed amplified. The wind howling, the creak of the wooden beams, and faintly, footsteps in the hallway. I got up to investigate, expecting to find Victor wandering around. Instead, the hallway was empty. The air felt colder than usual, and I swear I could hear faint whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went back to bed. The next morning, Victor was gone. His room was empty, the bed untouched, as if no one had been there at all. I even checked the front door, but there were no footprints in the fresh snow. It didn't make sense. He couldn't have left without leaving some trace. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. That night, I was sitting by the fire again when I heard it. The knocking. I frowned, save my heart pounded in my chest as I slowly walked to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there, just the blizzard howling outside. Then I heard the creak of a floorboard behind me, spinning around. I saw Victor standing in the middle of the road, but he looked different. His face was even paler, his eyes sunken and dark. "Thank you for letting me in," he said, his voice hollow and cold. "But you shouldn't have." Before I could react, the fire in the hearth went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, Victor was gone. The air was icy, and the whispers I'd heard the night before were louder now, circling around me. I ran to my room and locked the door, huddling under the blankets like a terrified child. The next morning, the storm had cleared. I packed my things and left the lodge, quitting the job without explanation. Later, I learned that Victor wasn't a man. He was a legend decades ago. A guest named Victor had gotten lost in a storm and found to death, trying to find shelter. Some say his spirit still roams the area, searching for warmth, searching for someone kind enough to let him in. I'll never forget his last words. "You shouldn't have." Now I know why.